It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Amna Akbar, who is this year at Princeton at the Law and Public Affairs program and otherwise at Ohio State, and has done extraordinary work on issues of policing and now police abolition and questions of prison abolition. And so those are the topics that we're going to go into today. And we're going to start with this idea from Allegra MacLeod's article, Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice, which you've all read, where she kind of spells out the effort, her effort in that article. And she writes on page 1161, "If prison abolition is conceptualized as an immediate and indiscriminate opening of prison doors, rejection of abolition is perhaps warranted. But abolition may be understood instead as a gradual project of decarceration, in which radically different legal and institutional regulatory forms supplant criminal law enforcement." So the way that both Allegra and you, Amna, kind of present the idea and the ambition of prison abolition is as a horizon, an ethical perspective, one that I believe we have to embrace. In the same way that we embraced abolition in the slavery context, I'd say that we must embrace abolition of our carceral society. And this goes back decades and centuries, actually. One of my personal heroes was Clarence Darrow, actually. And there's this beautiful passage that Allegra quotes on page 1206 from Darrow, and a speech that he gave to the Cook County Jail in 1902 in Chicago, where he closes that, "A jail is evidence of the lack of charity of the people on the outside who make jails and fill them with the victims of their greed." And that kind of captures so much of the problem of our carceral state. Now, in particular, Amna, I invited you to talk about this because, of course, I know that you agree with the horizon and the ambition, and you've written about it as well. And you've actually pushed it a little bit beyond just the prison to larger aspects of policing, and so you note that in your article, Towards a Radical Imagination of Law, right, where you speak specifically about the vision that's written by the Black Lives Matter group of ending not just mass incarceration, but also police in schools, ending mass surveillance by police, privatization of police, capital punishment, money bail, and fines and fees. The use of criminal history is relevant to determining access to housing, education, voting, and other rights and benefits, immigration detention and deportation, and ICE raids. So it's even a larger project, really, that you're involved with. And we've all read your piece, and we're really stimulated by it. And so I wanted to start maybe by asking you, how did you get involved in this work? What is it that kind of brought you into this area from what was before a kind of a classical criminal law perspective, right?
Right, yeah. So thanks Bernard, I've been working on issues of racial justice, criminal law reform, and immigration law reform to some extent for quite some time. And the idea of abolition in the abstract has been around for a couple of decades, most prominently since Critical Resistance, the organization, was formed in the late 90s with Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore at the helm. And so I remember, I think about a decade ago, being in a bar actually in Brooklyn when a friend explained to me what abolition meant for the first time. And it was so jarring, that moment, to my lawyerly trained brain, that I still kind of remember that moment pretty crystal clear. And so it's kind of been in my larger vision for quite some time. But at first it just sounded like I think it probably does to a lot of people, at least who are trained in law, or who are kind of ensconced in thinking about criminal law and criminal law reform from a more criminology type point of view, that it sounds kind of crazy in a way. But over time, as I deepened my study of mass incarceration and policing, it became clear to me, as it obviously has for a great number of people, that the problem of mass incarceration is one of grand scope and scale, and as Allegra talks about in her article, a problem that's historically situated and embedded, a system that perpetuates grave dehumanization, derives from a history of racial violence, and it's unclear what results it's creating aside from, what results it's creating aside from the great ideological work it does in kind of keeping things as they are. And then in 2014, Ferguson happened, the rebellion there happened, and I had already been working on policing, mostly in studying the shape of policing after 9/11 and how the national security state kind of emerged in a particular form around the idea of the Muslim threat. But the rebellion in Ferguson and then Baltimore, and paying attention to all the kind of movement activity that was happening in different forms, both where I lived at that time, or I live now in Columbus and around the country, really forced me to think more deeply and more critically about race, law, and law reform. And so, in a way that, kind of you have deep realizations again and again, or at least I'm one of those people, that was a period of time in which I was kind of convinced anew, or thinking again about what does it really mean that inequality in this country is structural, that it's historically embedded, and that kind of pushed me on a, on kind of a road to greater and different study and looking more outside of law to think about what the problem of mass incarceration and policing is really about. And one of the things that I write about in the piece that was really striking to me is that when I was actually in movement spaces, either just as a participant or because I was thinking about how to support these movements as a lawyer, that the conversations around criminal law and its history, criminal law reform, seemed so much more grounded in what I knew to be the realities of policing and mass incarceration, not just from my study, but as someone who grew up in Black and brown communities in the United States. And so in that way, I found myself much more riveted and interested by those conversations than I often found at, for example, criminal law conferences. And so that kind of pushed me to deepen my study and kind of pay attention to what these movements are doing. And then on top of that, when I would go to legal academic conferences in particular, and people were talking about the movement and its race politics, at the time I felt that there was a little bit of misrecognition of what the movement, or the more kind of left-oriented movement organizations were doing. So for example, there'd be a lot of conversation around body cameras, which of course came up, the embrace of body cameras comes in reaction to movement organizing, but those weren't the conversations that I was hearing in those spaces, and so it felt important to try to understand and do a deeper dive into the movement politics. And so as I kind of continued my study and kind of both with the movements and trying to think about what are the claims that they're making, it made me, and remember I said I was embracing in a new way the structural nature of law, inequality, and violence. What I was kind of looking for and thinking about, and what I wasn't finding in traditional law reform spaces, was kind of a more radical way to think about these problems. Because if you think a problem is structural, then the responses we need to kind of be geared towards transforming the way that we address them and that we think about them, and a kind of institutional responses that we have about them. And it was clear to me that we could have debates about body cameras or new prison facilities, but that these things are ultimately not going to change that underlying logic or that underlying infrastructure. And so it felt really unsatisfying to me. And then in the meantime, this kind of year-long process took place where the Movement for Black Lives put out this policy platform. And when it came out and I studied it, what I found really profound and striking was that on the one hand, the analysis, if you kind of read between the lines of police violence, was fairly similar to what you find in the DOJ's reports on Baltimore and Ferguson, but that they come out in totally different directions in terms of the reforms that they're pushing for. And so that forced me then to kind of think about what's the difference here in these different approaches, and what can we learn about law reform and a more radical approach to law reform if we study and take the vision seriously. And then the two things that came out of that I was most intrigued by, and that still kind of propel my work now, that made that agenda different, or the vision different. One is that it's abolitionist in nature, and two, that there's a critique of capitalism kind of at its heart. And so it's not a traditional kind of, what you might think of as a traditional law reform approach to criminal law or racial injustice questions. And I don't really get into this in the article, but I should say I don't think everything in the vision is 100% abolitionist or 100% consistent with what you might call an anti-capitalist vision. But those strands were there in ways that felt more serious to me than anything I had seen before, and I thought that felt important again because these were structural takes on structural problems. And often in law reform conversations, we're talking about issues that are structural, historical, deep, and wide, and yet the reforms we're talking about seem not based in a larger transformative vision, and also tinkering at the margins in a way that felt unsatisfying. And so finally, I'm excited about this conversation because abolition is such an expansive, imaginative, and radical vision, and one that's very much about collective work and conversation, that I still feel very much like a student of these ideas. But there's really three things I would say that captivate me about an abolitionist approach to criminal law reform, or abolition as a horizon, as Bernard put it. One, like I said, it's radical and it's structural, right? So it recognizes that the problem of our carceral society, like a lot of legal and other scholarship has recognized, is a structural problem, and it responds to it. So the scale of critique matches the scale of vision, and that is something that is compelling to me. The second thing, like I was mentioning, is that abolition is a collective project. It's a project about enhancing kind of democratic processes and collaborative work. So one of the things that's really striking when you listen to abolitionists talk, like so for example in this fall, there was actually a lot of panels at both the American Studies and Women's Studies conferences. In the fall they shared a week in Atlanta on abolition, and one of the emphases that all of the panelists were making, and they came both from movement spaces and more scholarly spaces, was that core to the abolitionist approach is this idea that no one person can have the answers, and that an academic can't sit up here and tell you what that abolitionist vision is going to look like, but it's very much about embracing kind of a collective experimental process that says, we don't know exactly how we're going to get there, we can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, this is not a, and we still believe that this is the horizon we should be fighting for, and so it's embracing of a process. And then the third thing is precisely this kind of unsettling that I'm drawn to, which is that I think a lot of these deep historical structural questions don't have easy answers, and I think or obvious answers. And so I think the way that the abolitionist horizon is framed towards imagination and questioning and unsettling, and it's almost a mode of inquiry in a way I find really important to kind of embrace and think about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that's really helpful because it raises a couple of important aspects of the abolitionist project, the structural issues and also the open issues about kind of questions that we have to address. Probably the best place I think to start maybe would be just to lay the foundation for the conversation, to get a sense of what is prison abolition. And as I had mentioned, just reading the early passage from Allegra's and your articles, if as is often suggested, if we think of it as immediately closing all prisons,
right,
it's an inconceivable mountain. But instead we have to think of it as a longer-term project. But as a longer-term project, it's one that is very different from the reform projects that exist. Reform projects that are intended to make the prison better in some sense. And those projects have been ongoing for centuries now. I mean, you read, you read the history of the prison, for instance, Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and from the beginning it was a question of the failures of the prison that generate reforms for prison, and prison is always kind of caught up in a reform process that is intended to fix problems, whereas the abolitionist perspective is one that intends to get rid of the prison ultimately, right? And of course, I think that makes a tremendous amount of sense for anyone who's actually spent time in prison, either as a lawyer or as an educator or as an inmate or as family of someone who's been incarcerated, that when you experience the prison, I think you come out of it feeling this is a space that needs to be eliminated, right? But I think that it's first important to kind of lay the foundation to the abolitionist project to distinguish it from others, right? And you yourself were distinguishing it from criminal justice reform projects. You want to say a word about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so Rachel Hertzing, who is one of the kind of core organizers or has been with critical resistance, often talks about how the main difference between criminal law reformers and abolitionists is that for criminal law reformers, they think that the system of the carceral society, the prison, the police is fundamentally good, that it's doing well by society, and that the problems are kind of in a sense marginal to the project. And so the goal of the criminal law reformer is to kind of get rid of those marginal excess or bad costs of the system in order to preserve the good kind of core to it. Whereas for an abolitionist, the purpose of the criminal legal system is precisely to subjugate people on the basis of class, race, gender, sexuality, and to kind of preserve the power structure, the capitalist, white supremacist power structure as it is. And so the abolitionist thinks that the criminal legal system, in its kind of ugly and devastating scope and scale, is doing precisely what it's meant to. And so the abolitionist goal is not to tweak the criminal justice system in order to preserve the good core, but to get rid of it altogether in order to think about different ways of governing what are ultimately social problems that we could think very differently about how to address. So, and then the other thing that Rachel talks about a lot, which I think is really helpful for these kinds of conversations, is about how the word reform, all it means is change. And so a reform on its own isn't necessarily a good thing or even a bad thing. Oftentimes, I think when people read this article, and it's probably mostly my failure, they think, oh, the movement for Black lives or abolitionists are against reform. But no, the Vision for Black Lives or groups like Critical Resistance or BYP 100, they are fighting for law reform, but they're trying to articulate and push agendas for abolitionist reform as opposed to kind of traditional criminal law reform or criminal justice reform. Mm-hmm. And so to think about how to do that, I think, is a difficult question, but that's part of what these groups are trying to do. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Okay, so in what you said, I think there are two really important dimensions. One is the question of the system, and the other
right.
is the question of the political nature of these issues. So on the first, you mention this issue of the criminal justice system, and when we think of it as a system, and one of my pet peeves is thinking about the criminal justice system as a system, mm-hmm. which is an invented concept. I mean, the idea that it has a coherence as a system that can then have its own objectives, for instance. Systems right. have objectives, right? And that whole way of thinking about a sphere of human interactions has a fallacy in it that makes you want to fix the system in order for it to work better, mm-hmm. basically. And all of a sudden you start thinking about system needs, ways of fixing the system, problems of the system, failures, weaknesses, tweaks to the system, but you remain with the same objective of the system, which is to, isolate issues of crime and punishment and treat them in one whole. And I heard that a number of times in what you were saying, in part because that is the way we are trained to think as lawyers, but even just as citizens today in America. I believe that we are trained to believe that there is something called a criminal justice system, when in fact, right, there isn't. I mean, there isn't in the sense that it's a fabricated idea. It's a metaphor. And the minute that you create it as a metaphor for dealing with crime, criminal justice, right, you've actually set as an objective dealing with crime, rather than making individuals whole, whole human beings, well beings, right? So that seems to be one important piece here. And it was reflected really in how you got involved, because you yourself had been trained to have this idea of the criminal justice system. And then the second piece that seems critical, it's kind of like it's almost an underlying precept or assumption of prison abolition or abolition, is that this space is a political space, right? It's not about simply crime and punishment. It's about relations of power, and that's the piece that you were just talking about now. Let's first talk a little bit about the notion of the criminal justice system before getting to the political dimension of punishment and crime. What is your sense of kind of how entrenched that is, and how it's possible to make headway against that idea of a criminal justice system?
I guess I had two things. One, when you're in these movement spaces, and if you read abolitionist materials, language is really important, because of course language is a tool of power, and how we talk about things makes a big difference in what gets naturalized and what's not. So for example, a lot of abolitionists will not talk about imprisoning people. They'll talk about putting people in cages, just so that it's a little bit more concrete what we're talking about. One of the really interesting things, which if you haven't noticed already, if you start to pay attention now, you'll see it, is that people in these spaces don't use the phrase criminal justice system. People say criminal legal system, and that's a way to kind of denaturalize that what we do under the auspices of criminal law enforcement is any form of justice. So I think for the movement organizations and the abolitionist organizations that I'm looking at, that's kind of one key move, and it doesn't challenge the system part, but it takes the justice out of the frame in a way that's interesting. And then the second thing that is often done is, and it still doesn't touch the system part, but is to say, let's not talk about crime, but let's talk about harm. So the idea of crime in a lot of, when you hear, again, abolitionists talk, or in their campaigns or in materials, people are hoping to and attempting to denaturalize the context of crime, but a lot of these, one of the things that really surprised me this fall when I spent a lot of time looking at these materials is how a lot of contemporary abolitionist work is very deeply feminist in its orientation. And so there's a lot of emphasis on how do we think about questions of harm, that we're thinking about, for example, harm that happens in families and in relationships and that sort of thing. So intimate violence, for example, is very high on the radar in terms of what people are thinking about. And so a lot of these movement intellectuals and materials talk about, we're not trying to, they're clear that the project is not to ignore the harm in society. And in fact, people will often say things like, harm is, in a sense, embedded in human relationships. It's just a question of kind of trying to think about what are the different sorts of harms, what kind of responses should we have to these different kinds of harms, and how do we redress the harms that are systemic in one way, routine, embedded in unequal relations of power, and that sort of thing. And so the switch from crime to harm is another thing that often happens. None of this goes to the system part. I need to think about that more.
Right,
but
yeah. Although, I would want to push on both of those terms, criminal and harm as well. So retaining the notion of criminal, it seems to me, I understand very well trying to get rid of the word justice in its association with the criminal justice system. And so oftentimes people resist that idea, talk about the criminal injustice system, or just get rid of it, use legal instead of criminal justice. And that makes a lot of sense. I would want to go further, though. Not only so, each of the three terms in my mind is deeply problematic. The system we've already talked about, but criminal as well is the deeply problematic term, because essentially what it's trying to suggest is that there is a space that involves crime and punishment that is not political. It's carving out a space, a pristine space to make us think that the definition of crime itself is not a political intervention, but the point is that every definition of crime is itself the product of relations of power. And how we define, how we target, how we enforce is going to be a political act, not a separate specialist criminal law act. And I'm looking particularly at the criminal law students right now, when we define and when we decide to enforce, say, street crimes that are more public crimes, we are engaged in a political intervention. And when we decide not to, say, consider Flint, Michigan as a crime, and to deal with it through the criminal justice system, again, we're making a choice as a political choice as to what we consider criminal, what we're going to deal with through the criminal justice system. And there's no, and when you look at harm is a problematic term, which we'll come to next, but when you look at the aggregated injuries that would have been caused by something like the Flint, Michigan water situation over decades, the aggregated injuries are most likely going to be far greater than the aggregated injuries associated with most theft in this country, Or if you look at the aggregated injuries associated with the mortgage-backed securities collapse, the lack of a regulatory system to deal with mortgage-backed securities in 2011, the amount of injuries aggregated in this country would be far worse than kind of property crimes aggregated for those years, And so the question becomes, how is it that we decide that particular injuries are going to be addressed by the criminal justice system and others not? Now, that is a decision that is purely a reflection of our political economy in this country, but it's masqueraded under this idea of crime and criminality. Just as punishment itself is also much more than simply a response to crime. We can get to punishment next. Let's stick with crime and criminality for a second, because we've got a lot on the table. We also have harm. I want to get to punishment in a second. What do you think about these questions of kind of the word, retaining the word criminal? Should we be retaining the word criminal?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the phrase criminal or crime in itself aims to naturalize the work of criminal law enforcement, because by the time it's a crime, then we have a certain framework that we're already drawing on. The interesting thing in just hearing you talk is it makes me think about why that phrase still persists in the abolitionist kind of materials that I've been reading. And it might have something to do with how in a lot of left, people of color, kind of political spaces, the idea of criminalization has been so kind of deeply contested that it doesn't connote neutrality or goodness, the idea of crime or criminality. But I think for the larger kind of political project of denaturalizing criminal law enforcement, it does seem important to think about other ways to talk about it. And then I think you're also absolutely right that part of the work of criminalization or policing or prison of the carceral state is to shift these social problems that are products of that are structural problems that are products of relations of power from the collective responsibility onto the individual body, right? So the problem, so one of the things, I teach first year criminal law, and I often have my students sit in the local municipal court for a day to see what happens in our local criminal courts. And I usually go with them. And one of the things that's been really striking, being in Columbus, Ohio, is that one of the common crimes when you sit there is theft from Walmart specifically. And it made me wonder how many around the country, given the geographical space that Walmart takes up, how many of these charges are happening around the country. But so theft, for example, for small amounts, when you're punishing someone for stealing, which is essentially a survival crime, we are displacing questions about distribution of food, housing, whatever all the things people need to be materially at ease onto individual wrongdoing. And so it blames the individual person, and it takes away responsibility from society and from the collective from dealing with those problems. But then there's also the other side of it, which Bernard was just talking about, which is that it also then takes away the things that aren't called crimes are also then naturalized as not that bad for our benefit, not something that we can intervene with through, that we don't have tools to respond to it, or that it's just not a problem to begin with, and that is problems, kind of fairly straightforward problems of political economy, like the mortgage-backed crisis, mortgage-backed loan crisis, but it's also, when you think about more overt questions of plain violence that the state perpetuates. So, for example, the police killings that Black Lives Matter brought attention to, or even drone strikes in other parts of the world. But what we think about when we give the state the power to decide what kind of injuries we are collectively acting on behalf of, it, there's a lot of we need to rethink that. Yeah.
Right. So we need to fundamentally rethink the category of crime, which is so alien to what we do. In law school or typically. And then we also need to rethink the category of punishment. And here, of course, there's been a lot of work done on that over the 20th century. And starting with, or at least going back to Rusch and Kirchheimer, who were part of the Frankfurt School, and in 1939 they wrote a very important text called Punishment and Social Structure, which tried to view punishment not simply as kind of the retributive response to crime, but as part of the political economy of a society, right? And the idea was to show how different forms of punishment are actually pieces of a political project, a political economic project. And of course they went through the history of punishment, going back centuries, and dug up beautiful instances of when punishment was so obviously a political project. So one of my favorite illustrations from Punishment and Social Structure is this letter they found from a prosecutor writing to Louis XV in the Ancien Régime in France, basically saying where the prosecutor writes to the king, "You're going to be very pleased. We were able to condemn 20 men to the galleys today. I know that you need more men for your ships." right? And it was so patently clear that the process was not a question of punishing and retribution. It was a process of filling the ships with men who would row, right? And of course, over time, this changes, but we get the same phenomena with convict leasing as forms of punishment. We get the same, and then we get the same phenomena through forms of mass incarceration that are kind of a way of emptying out the ghetto and creating a hyper ghettoized space. When we start going down that path, we then de-link punishment and the criminal justice systems from that naturalized crime space, and we replace it in a political sphere where I think where it belongs. I think it's a fundamental move necessary to undergird the prison abolition ambition, is to understand the political dimensions, and I think it can be done in a number of ways, historically or through archives, but I think it's also being done more today through precisely what you talk about, through militancy, through activism, through the ways in which we are seeing that justice is not being meted out in a fair and neutral way in response, but is being used as an oppressive tool or a tool to regulate particular communities. And I take it that's where most of your work and most of the Black Lives Matter work comes to the issue from that perspective.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think the example I've been thinking about recently is the question of homelessness, right? Which, of course, we know the homeless are so heavily policed and are often in and out of jail. And the reason, and so when I've been kind of reading, one of the things I've spent the last month doing is kind of looking over criminal law scholarship that talks about police and kind of thinks about how we reform policing to try to get a sense of, I'm trying to work up a scheme of kind of what are the traditional moves in, when we talk about policing reform in law conversations. And there are a lot of assumptions that are made in that scholarship, including assumption that, an assumption that the criminal law or policing is doing what it purports to do, and kind of effectuating retribution or deterrence for crime. And so with the question of homelessness, for example, if we really want, I mean, this is such a simple example, but I think for me this is kind of helpful because you have to kind of constantly be retraining your brain to kind of fight the current, is if we really, the concern really was homelessness and addressing it and ending it, it's really very simple. You just have to build housing for people, right? And find, give people a place to live and figure out, and then build obviously larger social programs or fight for a social wage so that people have access to the resources they need. But that's not really something that people think about, in part because of what you were saying before, which is that once we start talking about criminal law, criminal legal system, criminal justice system, people feel like they're functioning within a very particular space where the moves are constrained in a particular way. And so in the, both at the national level and at the local level, in the Vision for Black Lives, there's kind of this invest, divest demand that's kind of take money out of prisons, jails, and police and put it into various forms of social programs. So in Columbus, where I live, there was a prominent kind of counselors, not cops, campaign to take money out of the local budget for police and put it into different forms of counseling services. And in the article, I think I talk about Youth for LA, which is a coalition in Los Angeles that calls for taking 1% of the budget from all of the different law enforcement agencies in Los Angeles and putting into various youth programs, everything from jobs to nonviolent conflict resolution people, paid internships and things like that. And so I think, so the reason why I think these campaigns are important is because they very practically get at the question of how we might reimagine addressing these same problems. And in that way, I think they're really helpful.
Right. And that's really helpful because that then pushes us towards the question of what are some of the kind of the real tangible initiatives that are part of the prison abolition effort, right? And you just pushed us in that direction. And so just to kind of clarify on the theoretical, what we get there, I take it, because we no longer view the question of crime and punishment from a liberal legal perspective, which naturalizes crime, naturalizes punishment, naturalizes the system, and tries simply to make the system function better, to get the wheels of justice to turn better, to make the prison less violent, or all of the kind of liberal reforms, versus once you have denaturalized crime and punishment and seen the political dimension and understand it as both as a political economy, right? And no different than slavery was a political economy, but a political economy that is basically funneling predominantly persons of color, young persons of color, into a prison complex, right? Once you have denaturalized all these things and you view it from a different perspective, then you start to ask yourself these questions. How else could we be doing, how else could we be managing social relations, right? And that, I take it, is the abolitionist, the place where the abolitionist really kind of comes into contact with reforms and changes, right? In other words, it's a regulated space, it is relations of power, it is a political economy. How can that political economy be governed differently? What are the regulatory mechanisms? Mm-hmm. And you just suggested one. To deal with a problem like homelessness, there are other ways to deal with it than through the criminal justice system. That's true, of course, of all of the minor crimes. And so one of the big issues during the whole debate over broken windows policing and the whole debate over the question of whether minor disorder causes crime, I mean, one part of it was, look, I mean, a big part of it was, well, there's no evidence that minor disorder causes crime, but the other big part of it was, well, if you really focus on particular forms of disorder, there are lots of ways to deal with them other than through police enforcement. And you just named one, homelessness. All of the other kind of minor crimes as well. Prostitution, there's licensing, there are other forms of ways, graffiti, there are sanitation departments deal with the graffiti, not just police officers. City like Chicago deals with graffiti by through the sanitation department, basically. It's like there's, they're responsible for cleaning it up. It's not a question of sending the police and arresting people. So there's all of the ways in which we could possibly manage, but I take it there's all manage, do redesigns. As you know, in your work and in Allegra's work, there are a number of different elements. You just spoke about justice reinvestment in part, but there's also redesigns, attention right. to neighborhoods. You had mentioned Walmart earlier, right? I'm sure there are ways to secure a space like Walmart so that it's preventative in the sense of less shoplifting, etc. But I take it there's even larger issues about the political economy, and that's where discussions of capitalism mm-hmm. and discussions of neoliberalism come in, right? The difficulty there, I take it, is that those are really long-term projects of reimagining an economy. How do we deal with that issue in the context of abolition?
Yeah, I think that's a big question that I haven't really seen anyone quite take on. I mean, if you pay attention to the Twitter sphere, sometime in the last 3 to 6 months, there was kind of a debate where socialists were kind of charging abolitionists, which is not to say there's not an overlap, but just for a second, socialists were charging abolitionists as being naive and kind of fighting for a utopian vision of the world that we're never going to get to. Of course, there's a lot of ironies there, but I thought, that's kind of interesting that, that these kind of, this, I don't know, that there hasn't been kind of a connection or a teeing out of how this goes together. The only place where I've seen some attention to this is in some of Critical Resistance's material. They have this, I think it's called A World Without Walls organizing handbook, where they have a couple of pages that talk about, why do people come to abolition, what convinces them, and in there they talk about how being anti-prison, wanting to take down the prison walls can be consistent with a variety of perspectives on the state, and they allude to the fact that you might be more anarchist-oriented and kind of be anti-state altogether, or you might be more socialist, communist, and not be against a state, but be looking to reorganize the state in a very different way. But even there, just kind of like it's a gesture. It's not. They don't really get into it. So I think my hope, and this is something that I want to spend time thinking about. My hope is that as the left grows, one of the exciting things that's happening right now is that all these questions about various left political commitments the debates are becoming more intense because it's starting to feel, the moment is filled with possibility, right? I think partly because we have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I think part of her power that people haven't talked about enough is that she's taking what are being articulated in social movement context, not just the Green New Deal, but even, for example, some of the things she said about ICE that are being taken from movement context, and then she's kind of enacting them or showing us one way that they could be translated into the legislative sphere, and in that way kind of also showing the productive tension that can be created if you have active social movements and growing democratic mass politics on the left and people who feel accountable to them in lawmaking bodies. Okay, but back to your question. Yeah.
Although you're right on it, I think. I mean, you're right on it in the sense that the question is reconfiguring the political economy in such a way as to eliminate or to constrict the interactions and the spaces that lead conventionally to criminal justice outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so you're right. You're right in it.
Right.
But I mean, but that does raise questions of temporality, that's a longer term project necessarily than some of the reforms, such as eliminating or legalizing marijuana or legalizing other substances, decriminalizing, expunging all convictions for, etc. Some of the community self-care solutions that are offered in terms of reducing gun violence through, interrupters in the community, redesigns, etc. Those are much shorter term and more immediate ways of decreasing populations, bail reform, elimination of cash bail, many of which have huge traction. Right, and we've seen it. We've seen it in New York. We've seen it in New York City. I mean, Rikers Island is far less populated than it was just a couple of years ago, right? As a result of a lot of efforts, a lot of militancy, a lot of work for the closed Rikers, but also efforts to eliminate cash bail or efforts to bail people out, and also some reforms at the feeding level in terms of getting pushed into Rikers. But the numbers are seriously down from where they were. I mean, they're in the 7,000s now, whereas they used to be at the 11, 12,000s just a few years ago. So, so there are a lot of immediate ways in which this can be done. But then there's a larger project, which is really to transform the political economy of the country and the political economy of punishment. really, which is what then pushes us into these debates about social democrats, about Green New Deal, et cetera.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think the trouble is I don't think you can separate the question of transforming the political economy from transforming the carceral state, partly because, and I haven't done the math, but if you look at, I have a strong impression that if you look at military expenditure, prison, and policing expenditure, if you kind of were able to do the math to kind of get all those numbers together, a tremendous amount of our economy is invested in the carceral state and its projections abroad as well. And so, and I think that's probably in some sense precisely why these reforms get the pushback, because there's a lot at stake when people are, for example, fighting the bail industry. And so, I think part of what these movements are trying to do, and kind of the limits of them, is to kind of think about is to rethink these questions. And so one thing that's not clear to me, well, when I was reading the materials in the fall closely, one of the things that was really striking to me that I didn't quite understand before sinking into the abolitionist materials is precisely how they do seem deeply committed to reorganizing our society, including the political economy, but that the exact contours of that are not altogether clear, partly because I think of the where, that's been kind of a fledgling kind of movement or number of people working on it until more recently, but these questions are gaining increasing relevance. But in terms of thinking about abolitionist law reform, I've been working with someone, Marbury Staley Butts, who is one of the lawyers who is involved in drafting the Vision for Black Lives with a number of other people. And we've been trying to kind of get at what is this distinction between what reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms, or reformist reforms and transformative reforms. And so the reason why this goes to your question is because some of this draws from contemporary abolitionist writings, and some of it draws from socialist thinking. So Andre Gorze's book, Strategy for Labor, is this book that thinks about how do we pass reforms in a way that makes socialism more within reach. And in that book, he talks about one of the key ingredients of those reforms would be places where you bring more people into the project of collective governance, particularly workers, so that workers can see their power and kind of exercise that in more meaningful ways. And so thinking about the Gore's kind of framework, in addition to the contemporary abolitionist framework, we have come up with a couple of different factors that we think, there's no one example that kind of hits all four of these, but the four factors that we've kind of been thinking about are kind of a framework for thinking about abolitionist reform, and one of those is precisely this kind of getting more people into the project of collective governance, drawing from the Gore's framework, because part of the way that the carceral society exists and that neoliberal capitalism kind of governs is precisely by mass exclusion from democratic and politics. And so trying to figure out how to build movements that can address that by taking on the carceral state and our political economy seems to me kind of at the center of the work.
Right, bringing those conversations and those ambitions together, right?
Yeah.
Would be key, right, yeah. So just a few more thoughts before I definitely want to open it up to all of you to ask questions and to get a conversation going. It's interesting. I found it interesting that the relationship to the notions of preventive justice, and so in Allegra MacLeod's piece, she refers to the tradition of preventive justice. Referring specifically, actually going back to Bentham and others from the early 19th century, who thought of this space as being more favorably or better regulated if we thought of prevention rather than enforcement, right? Of course, many of the prevention techniques tragically end up being very punitive. So many of the ways in which we think about prevention end up resulting in forms of, or particularly practices that can be exceedingly punitive. So for instance, preventative detention is a preventive measure, or detention, or post-carceral preventative detention. So ever since the 1990s in this country, people can be administratively detained even after they've fulfilled their full sentence because they're a danger. Particularly if it's a sexual offense, then you can be administratively detained. You're no longer being punished, but you happen to be similarly placed in a cage. But it's not. And those are forms of punitive or punitive preventive justice that are often the direction in which a lot of prevention goes, or requiring people to remain in house arrest, or using particular forms of surveillance, etc. So there's always this danger. Of course, Allegra and you talk about a more grounded notion of prevention, I think, which still raises questions, or at least has to acknowledge that what we're doing is shaping society, right? Which goes back to the issue of harm. Notions of prevention and notions of regulating differently than through the criminal justice system are inherently going to be projects that are, in a sense, moralizing projects, regulatory projects. The notion of harm is itself a moral notion. It's not as if we have an objective definition of what harm is. And of course, you were talking about the fact that much of it comes from feminist thought, which will have a particular way of thinking about harm. I was intrigued, and it was for me kind of meaningful when Allegra referenced Colquhoun, who was one of the original inventors of police forces in England at the beginning of the 19th century. And what struck me there actually was that Colquhoun actually plays a huge role in Foucault's punitive society, and actually such a role that I remember that when I edited it, there's this whole discussion of Colquhoun as being someone who was engaged in a moral process, so that the preventive policing effort was actually a moralizing process against the what he called the lower classes, right? And there's this beautiful passage in the Punitive Society, which I had pulled out to be the actual kind of the epigraph to the book. It stuck it at the end of the book, where Foucault says, "Unfortunately, when we teach morality," and this you'll love this because this is CC, right? Contemporary civilization. When we teach morality, when we study the history of morals, we always analyze the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, right? We always go to Kant or some great like classic philosopher to understand morality when we think about morality. This character, Kant, who is fundamental for our morality. The inventor of the English police, this Glasgow merchant who settles in London, where in 1792 shipping companies ask him to solve the problem of the superintendence of the docks and the protection of bourgeois wealth. He's the one that we should be studying, right? Not Kant, but this Colquhoun who invented the police. This is a basic problem. To understand society's system of morality, we have to ask the question, where is the wealth? The history of morality should be organized entirely by this question of the location and movement of wealth. And that was precisely what Colquhoun was doing when he was setting up the police and setting up these interventions. That he was moralizing, in a sense, and trying to regulate the lower classes, right? And so, you know, the principles that he developed, for instance, The first principle is that foundation of a penal system must be morality. This was called Kuhn. The second principle, if the law must be especially concerned with morality, as if it's essential to the safety of the state and the exercise of its sovereign, an authority is needed to superintend not the application of the laws, but well before that, the morality of individuals. So the point is that we can't escape imposing particular visions on society. The one that is imposed through the crime and punishment, through the carceral state today, is of course tied to those fundamental political, economic, or political economies of punishment that were so moralized in terms of repressing or regulating the lower classes, the popular classes from the 19th century, or the ghetto today. But I take it that the challenge is to rethink those modes of regulation, understanding that we are ultimately imposing relations of power and ultimately imposing particular moral views throughout society. And that's a difficult task, I think. What kind of discussions surround those issues in the abolitionist sphere today?
I think these questions are particularly hard for lawyers because if you take the abolitionist project seriously and you think about the centrality of the carceral state in enforcing our political economic order, then it forces you to kind of question, if we take this away, then how else do we regulate society? What will be kind of the infrastructure or backing of law? What kind of holds everything in place? And I think the basic account from an abolitionist perspective to some extent has to do with, if we address people's needs for housing, food, healthcare, community, that sort of thing, that we will have a very different kind of society, and that the account of human nature that kind of arises from the carceral state and our commitment to crime and punishment as it is will be transformed, and that we currently kind of have it wrong. And so that's one cut on it. I think the other thing to kind of think about, and this has been a shift for me, is that one of the hardest things for me to learn when I started studying contemporary social movements and then trying to do work with them was precisely that their bid is to build power in order to govern society differently. And as someone who grew up in the 90s, the left kind of orientation was always one towards critique and towards kind of taking down in a way. And so part of what is both exciting and scary about these movements is that they kind of propel a vision of society that would govern, where governance would look very differently, but that doesn't mean there won't be a lot of the same difficult, well, not the same, but that there won't be difficult questions about how we generate that. I think an important part of this that's often missed in law reform conversations is precisely that, and this is why the Gore's point about reforms that come out of movements or collective organizing and that build space for collective governance is really important, is that abolitionist organizing, the movement for Black Lives, they're not just trying to come up with technocratic solutions or even grand visions of law reform that are different than how we might conventionally think of them. They're trying to build sites and spaces for collective struggle so that we are literally kind of transforming what society looks like in that way as well. So it's very process-based, which is part of the reason why we kind of can't, like I said at the beginning, we can't come up with the visions on our own or today, because part of the bid is that as we kind of get more people involved in thinking and actively addressing these collective problems, that the shape of how we address them and the possibilities will look really different.
Okay, I think that's a great point to open it up to questions then. Giancarlo?
I
don't know if we have a mic, or maybe should we use one? Okay, great, thanks. That way everybody can hear well.
So when I was reading your article, I really liked, or a pattern that I noticed was that you use the DOJ report to kind of legitimize the vision. Then you also use words like rebellion to kind of situate the movement for Black lives in like this long tradition of like American rebellions, and like that's just kind of like at the core of what it means to be American. And then I just saw a variety of mechanisms of essentially trying to make the radical and like the revolutionary like more palatable, or even just trying to look for open ears from someone who's like trained in law or like coming from a more liberal legalism perspective. And just to point to an example that's outside of your article, there's this one presidential candidate who is running on a universal basic income, and he presents it as the freedom dividend. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think are some of these like rhetorical tactics that we can use to at least start a conversation? Because in my experience, if you just say abolish ICE or abolish prisons, like you said, like you get that reaction of this is crazy. But like you kind of walked through it and then eventually got to that, and then you use those other things that I talked about. So I'm just wondering what other mechanisms like that can we use?
Thanks.
So it's interesting. So I wasn't quite trying to make the movement palatable, but I think that you're right that what I was trying to do in the article is to force the audience to take a more radical approach to thinking about law reform and the problems of mass incarceration and policing seriously. And I think that's because, so in other disciplines, like for example, American studies, where there's a much stronger, deeper, older kind of tradition of left thinking, you may not have to write that way in order for the audience to take you seriously. But partly because of the politics of the legal academy, that felt important to me because I wanted people to read the work, and I do think that the vision for Black lives and a lot of this movement work that's happening is really important, and people should take it seriously. The reason why the DOJ reports take up so much space in the article, I think, is provides part of the answer to your question, which is that I think we have to take liberal arguments and frameworks seriously and engage with them respectfully in order to kind of show what the benefits of a more radical approach will be, because it forces people, first of all, it forces those of us who take more radical approaches to actually have to carefully explain what we think and why we think, and I think that's really important, because I am not, and I hope we are not just trying to have a conversation in this law school, in this rarefied library. We're trying to generate ideas that will build mass movements and change the country, and that's not going to happen in the way that these movements want unless we're able to add thousands and thousands and thousands of people to these movements and these ideas. And so thinking about how to do that in a way that meets people where they are is really important.
And let me just add. So let me just add something here. I mean, one of the interesting aspects of the DOJ report was to document so clearly the way in which fines in Ferguson were supporting the municipality. To document so clearly the way in which Ferguson itself was financing itself through these forms of
Right.
fine and fees. Now, I mean, so there were different parts of the Ferguson report, and there were parts that dealt with the shooting. There was also another report that dealt with these questions of the criminal justice system more broadly. And even though the report itself was framed within, it was entirely within a kind of liberal legalist framework, and shows and can be used in these important ways to show the difference. it was pretty remarkable in documenting the way in which the political economy was working in Ferguson. And so, I don't know whether you recall this, but fees, criminal fees and fines, was the second largest revenue source for the municipality, right? Millions of dollars in a small municipality. In a municipality that actually was subsidizing a Fortune 500 company. So there is a Fortune 500 company that's located in Ferguson proper. And in the very same ways in which kind of municipalities will so often make it attractive because there'll be kind of special assessments, lower taxes, et cetera. And part of this we've just been living through in New York City with the whole Amazon deal, right? But what's clear from those studies, from the study and from the other evidence, was that it was the kind of perfect constellation, right, of neoliberal governance, whereby the city was essentially subsidizing a Fortune 500 company through fines and fees of poor people, basically. And of course, the remedies are going to be different, the reforms are going to be different, et cetera, but there was something very useful in some of the investigation that came out of that.
Right, no, I think that's absolutely right, and it goes to your point in the sense of, I think the DOJ report and the extent, quality, and granularity of their findings are helpful to a broader set of projects precisely because of how detailed they are and how they documented not just the routine police brutality of the Ferguson Police Department in ways that might seem more obvious, but in the ways that Bernard is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. Okay. Do you want to pass that to Sorry.
Hi, I was really intrigued by your exchange on the importance of language, especially when thinking about the word criminal and justice. And so kind of going off of that, I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the identity of the criminal in the United States today, especially given that the mere kind of possession or status of being a criminal affects your employment eligibility, your voting status, and virtually every application you apply for. What does the abolitionist ethic really foresee for either reforming the view of the criminal or eliminating it entirely?
So one thing we didn't get to talk about as clearly, I think, is that a lot of these abolitionist campaigns so we talked about, for example, invest, divest, right? So you take money out of prisons, policing, put it into something else. And so there are these kind of programmatic efforts to kind of think about how to respond to these social problems in a different way. But another core tenet, which is why the language piece is always emphasized, is, or a core commitment, is the ideological work of thinking about injuries or harm or social problems and to denaturalize them as crime, and to then take seriously the sort of social problems that they represent or that they are. And so as to the whole range of collateral consequences of criminal convictions, I mean, the kind of straightforward abolitionist stance on that was obviously that those things are wrong and that they should not, that those collateral consequences shouldn't be triggered and that people shouldn't be policed and imprisoned for all the different things that they currently are for. But in order to build towards that, we have to kind of get people to understand why those collateral consequences are a problem, what harm they exact on different communities, what the problems are with crime and punishment in the way that we do them today. And so the ideological component is really important. Critical Resistance in the last, I think, 9 months or so put out this really helpful chart that where it has 4 kind of dimensions to what are the sorts of police reforms you should be for or against. And one of the main vectors is that whether it challenges the notion that police increase safety. So the other vectors have to do with whether, the reform sends more, reduces funds to cops, reduces or increases their tools and technology, and reduces the scale of policing. So they're all kind of like attuned to the kind of material impacts, but being very always keenly aware of the ideological component of the work and of the criminal legal system. One of the 4 factors is, does this challenge the notion that police increase safety? And so thinking about the kinds of reforms that we put forward and how they kind of reconfigure both what good the police or imprisonment do, and then kind of what alternatives you can put forward are really central to what abolitionists today are doing.
Just to add a thought to that. I mean, so the use of words is so important. This ties, of course, to our last Fireside chat on how fascism works, right? Which is all about linguistics. It's all about discursive ways in which political strategies can function. I wish I could hyperlink to it, but I can't, right? But the terms, the delinquent, the term, the criminal, the felon, right? The ex-felon, those are today tools of the carceral system. Those terms have become so embedded in our language, and they become so naturalized, right? Particularly felon or ex-felon today. But that is the way in which the criminal justice system then functions in our mind, and then becomes this thing that we have to address through punishment. And the reason I would want to link it to the conversation about how fascism works is because we're seeing it so poignantly and tragically and viciously in President Trump's language associated with the caravan, with the wall, and with all of the policies that are associated with that, right? So the way in which he's creating an internal enemy that is made of criminals, right? Rapists, gang members, and using that rhetoric and using that imaginary and using that language as a way to justify then an entire political economy, an entire, a grab for power at this point with the state of emergency, the fake state of emergency. But it's all in the language that it's being done. And of course, it's through that language that we then are immobilized in some way or disarmed, really. Did you want to add something to that?
I just wanted to add that there was a graduate student last year, Leila Martinez.
Yes, yes. You want to add the mic? You want to give her the mic? Sorry.
So last year, a human rights student graduated. Her name is Leila Martinez, and she kind of spearheaded the Ban the Box initiative, which was kind of trying to make sure that institutions like Columbia wouldn't put a section about your formerly convicted status. And I remember when, hearing her speak, she rejected the label of criminal. She said, I'd like to be referred to exclusively as someone beyond my crime, or if I had to be called anything, formerly incarcerated person. So I think definitely thinking about kind of the importance of language, not just in how someone refers to themselves, but also how we within civil society who may not have such close proximity to the criminal justice system is also really important. So I just thought that I would add.
Right, yeah. Maddie, do you want to go next? Sorry.
So I think, and this is from reading your article and listening to this conversation, one area of tension that I perceived is this idea of temporality, both in, so there are the short-term and long-term goals of abolition, but there's also the idea that abolition is something that's gradual, and you still have these systems or institutions that are in place. You have people in prison, you have people who are being harmed by the police. So my question, I guess, is how do you, maybe as an individual, maybe as a movement, orient yourself around institutions that are doing harm, but that you also want to de-emphasize the legitimacy of. So that is, how do you, and you also said that people who are pro-abolition are not necessarily anti-reform, but reform is only kind of the short part of the short term. So that is to say, how do you position yourself around the prison? Is prison reform? How can you work towards prison reform that is helping the people who are currently in prison, while also kind of adopting this abolitionist agenda?
Molly, you want to jump in also?
Yeah, different topic.
Different topic? Okay. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
You can go next, Molly.
yeah, this is a really important question. How do you think about abolishing the carceral state and at the same time remain attuned to and connected to the struggles of people who are already incarcerated? I mean, I think the campaign in Florida to enfranchise incarcerated people is a good example of how to do that. It's not perfect, and certainly abolitionists who have a strong reaction against any kind of reform that draws distinctions between people on the basis of the severity of the crime have raised some critiques about that campaign. But to the extent that it was a law reform campaign to enfranchise incarcerated people, to denaturalize all the collateral consequences that we currently attach and assume are for our good, and that it came out of mobilizing and organizing people across a whole state. I think that's one kind of example of an approach. But I think, just to kind of underline, you're absolutely right that this is kind of a tension that any serious abolitionist I've listened to or talked to or read their work is always holding.
Good. Molly?
Hi, thank you both for this. It's incredibly fascinating. I think from what I understand, in order to implement abolition, you also need to tackle multiple other relations of power. And I'm thinking specifically of sexist oppression. In some traditional carceral feminisms, there's a thinking that our criminal legal system can help somehow negate sexually abusive practices that are associated with patriarchy. So I'm wondering, by getting rid of the infrastructure of the prison, what other tangible alternatives do we have for dealing with that system?
Right. So, I mean, there's two portions to this, just like with the other kind of reforms we were thinking about, in terms of, one question is to ask, what does policing and imprisonment do for rape, for example? Does it meaningfully redress rape or sex-based violence? Does it give any kind of repair or restoration to victims? Does it decrease rates of rape and so on and so forth? We could have a long conversation about this, but I think in short, the abolitionist answer to all of those is it doesn't meaningfully do any of those things for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one reason to kind of make sure that we think about is that, of course, we know that rates of gender-based violence are really high in prisons, and so part of the idea that incarcerating someone who might be a serial rapist or who has serially raped other people is going to decrease the rates of sex-based violence assumes that we don't take seriously the prison as a social space for which we're responsible. And so that's another kind of thing to think about. In terms of alternatives, I think this has been, I don't think there is a clear alternative I can point to other than to say that in movement spaces, there have been efforts to think about how to have kind of collective accountability processes where conversations and accountability mechanisms can be creative in a community in order to support the victim or the person who was raped, and figure out what kind of emotional support they need, what kind of material support they need, and that sort of thing. And similarly, to ask the person who, for example, committed the gender-based violence, what kind, to apologize, or to what kind of support they might need in order to not re-offend and to make a commitment to do that. One thing I recently read that, if you're interested in this question, I would recommend is this great pamphlet by an organization called Generation 5, which is an abolitionist organization that aims to end child sex abuse in 5 generations, and tries to think about how to do that without relying on policing and incarceration. One of the really powerful things they do in that guide, which kind of goes back to the beginning of the answer in a sense, is to say that the scope and scale of child sex abuse is so great that it's not something that we can police or incarcerate our way out of. And in fact, by incarcerating and policing it, we create it like this isolated problem that we can kind of get rid of those people and get rid of the problem. But of course, that's not true. But in that, one of the things that's really useful, and it's been a while since I looked at it, so I'm not going to be able to generate the examples, but they point to examples of in one of the Nordic countries, there's a hotline, for example, for people who have committed child sexual abuse, to kind of talk and get emotional support if those are impulses that they are having, in order, as a way to kind of provide support so they don't commit child sexual abuse. So they have examples from other countries of ways to kind of think about how to address these problems through collective processes and supporting people, accepting that these are problems of us, not outside of us, and so we have to try to figure out how to address them collectively.
Yeah, footnotes. Allegra, it's interesting that Allegra's article ends on the question of rape and the relationship of rape to criminal justice on page 1235, 1236, her discussion. So it is in the forefront of these debates, just as the question of criminalizing and punishing police officers is also, raises very kind of similar kind of tensions, right, within the community from which much of the abolitionist sentiment arises, and at the same time, there's this feeling that there needs to be accountability particularly for those crimes. It's part of it, I think. Part of the difficulty has to do with the with moral sense. For instance, when you refer to a service for a child sex offender to provide therapy or something, right? I think it's so hard for so many. It would be so hard for so many kind of ordinary Americans to say, wait a minute, we're providing a service to the offender in this situation, right? And it's because of this moral training that we have, in a sense, this moral training, this it's a bit of a vindictive moral training that we get that makes it so hard to imagine that as being the right response, when in fact, that might actually prevent the injury. Right? But the work that needs to be done somehow becomes work on more ethical training, our own ethical training. It's almost as if we have to learn how to care for ourselves in a particular way, so as not to fall victim to those kind of retributive impulses, say.
And to think about the enormity of these problems without being kind of frozen in response in face of how enormous they are. So in that, one line that is seared into my brain from that report, and I won't get it exactly right as a quote, but they say something like, most of us know someone who's been sexually abused as a child, which that part, I knew. Also, most of us know someone who has committed child sexual abuse, and that part really I found jarring because that wasn't something that I had thought about. And then looking at the statistics that they bring to bear in that report, I thought, wow. And if that's true, which it seems to be based on the numbers, then it should provoke a different way of thinking about how to address this problem.
Okay, so how many more questions do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 6. I think we can get to 6 questions. Oh, 7, right? 7? 6. Okay, Cassidy, you want to start? And then I think we'll try and get 2 or 3. Or if you had your hand up and it was like on the same topic, give me a 2-finger, okay? That was on the exact same topic? Okay, before you start, Cassidy, let's get you quickly and then on the exact same topic. Sorry, go.
Well, I guess it was really quite related to the notion of like a moral perspective on crime and looking at people who are, as you mentioned, like serial child rapists or just serial rapists or, murderers. A big field separate than like social justice that focuses quite contemporarily on prison reform is, not prison reform, but like criminal justice reform, is kind of neuroscience actually, and other kinds of biology who looks at the physiology behind criminals and criminal mentality, and especially with people who are serial rapists or serial murderers, which is obviously a lot less common. And I recognize that this conversation is mostly based around the issue of mass incarceration, and those are much pettier crimes that don't involve this. But how do you think the abolition movement speaks to the growing body of neurological work that does indicate a very physical dimension to the motivation behind people's crimes that cannot necessarily be counseled away or medicated away? So how do you deal with those cases, which I recognize are the vast minority of the cases, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend, there's a video on the website for the Barnard Center for Research on Women. It's a conversation between Dean Spade and Raina Gossett, where they kind of take on this question, and they point to 2 different things. One, which you gestured at, which is, and it's not necessarily about the neurological research, but it's about, kind of the rarity of these kind of monsters that are often constructed. And then second, they say it's really important to think about what is the ideological work that these kind of monsters are doing in constructing the violence that the carceral state enacts and the scale on which it enacts it. So I would just urge you to kind of think about that, because I think there is a disproportion. While those questions, the question of how to deal with serious violence, serious injury, serious harm, I think is important. We need to decouple that from current practices of criminal law enforcement, like Professor Harcourt was saying, right, in terms of thinking about the kinds of violence that we don't already take seriously within the criminal legal system. But then, in terms of these figures that are kind of haunt the way that we approach criminal legal enforcement, I think we need to think about what ideological work they're doing and what the scale of that problem actually is.
Okay, great. Let's get Cassidy in.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us, Professor Akbar. My question starts with a quote from your work and then also touches on something that you said earlier. So the quote is where you're kind of talking about this reorganization, recentering, and almost like a more positive view of how we're going to enact change, which is just like focusing on the experiences of people who have been marginalized and placing how we can help them more centrally than how we can prevent them from doing things. So you say...
what page?
Oh, it's on page 425.
425, okay.
Many of the organizations and movement spaces emphasize that these spaces are constituted of or led by individuals who share the group identity on behalf of which the movement is mobilizing. Black-only and Black-led spaces and organizations are the norm. These interventions are meant to be important at a discursive and material level, recognizing how the voices we hear, what they say, and how they speak constitute how we think, what we tolerate, and what we think is possible. So I thought that was like really intriguing and one of the most important quotations from the work, because it's really forcing us to look at the vision from the Movement for Black Lives and see that its greatest intention is to help and to focus on improving experiences as opposed to obviously like reforming the existing system and getting trapped within that system. And I know that we've addressed the temporal question a number of times, and earlier you were kind of talking about the rethinking of, say, the issue of lots of theft crime within Columbus, Ohio, from Walmarts, and how that's really an issue within Columbus of accessibility and distribution, and how do we get Columbus in the short term maybe to see that as a problem of people's experiences as opposed to people committing crimes. So I was just wondering if you think that there are ways in the short term, like amidst this project of abolition, that we can get this rethinking going, re-centralize these experiences, and actually help and promote this positive notion of we want to do good and want to reform how we think about these changes, as opposed to, or in the meantime, of this long-term project of abolition.
Do you want to take another question? No. Right. I mean, I think the short answer is that it all lies in movement building, right? And so it's kind of organizing people through community organizing and base building and running campaigns, building, conducting more militant actions of, direct action, that sort of thing. And so that's really the short version of the answer. I think another kind of lesson from Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal is precisely how grand visions can capture people's imaginations and mobilize them in a way that kind of tinkering can't. And so I think combining community organizing and campaigns on very discrete issues with a broad vision can be deeply transformative and can pull a lot of people in the way that we need to.
Good. So in the backs. And then
By the way,
maybe
my
we'll take
answers are
three.
getting shorter because of all the questions. If anyone
because
wants
we're
to
gonna
talk more afterwards, I'm happy
well,
to.
we're going to have a whole dinner together, so we're going to get to talk a lot more. But let's try and get in a few more.
So
1, 2.
whenever I read sort of like scholarly works about sort of things that seem very different from the status quo, I think about how one can embody that in their life as sort of like an individual moral actor. And the thing that I've been thinking about with your writing and the pieces that we read this week is how the carceral system is so embedded and sort of like the backbone of like a lot of society. So I wonder, and this is more just about like individual moral action, but say that like, how do I sort of like embody abolitionism in ways other than like being in a movement and like helping, in that like if someone commits what is now deemed a crime against me and I am morally opposed to the carceral system because of sort of all the bad impacts it has, do I call the police? Or like, do I become a public defender because I'm sort of appalled by, people getting put into these prisons and these systems, but at the same time, by being a public defender, I am then like an actor that is complicit in this entire system. And so I guess like, and I know this is like just a crazy kind of question that's a lot about like moral, like morality on an individual level, but I just like, from your writing and like from everything you've done, I'm just kind of wondering how, and you do participate actively in these movements, but I'm wondering how you see us as individuals who may not have the time or the resources to go and do the big legwork, how we can embody these kinds of things more wholly in our lives and in a way that is still sort of putting, like in a way that is actually not only effective for the movement, but in our lives.
Right.
Let me try and get a few more questions. Maybe, can you
Okay.
take some notes, maybe?
Yeah.
So that that way we can, sorry, let me just, yeah.
Hello.
And then,
So I'm wondering about sort of dismantling like ideas of criminality in the public sphere, because I think institutions definitely perpetuate like our ideas of criminality, but those become very real for people like in the public sphere and in the real world. And so now we see, well, throughout history, we've seen a lot of times, for example, white people sort of weaponizing the police and law enforcement against black people. So even recently, like a white person calling the police on black people for minding their business or like throwing a barbecue or something. I think at that point, it's an issue not so much of like when crimes are actually committed, but what we see as criminal, who we see as criminal. And so I'm wondering, sort of like dismantling those ideas of who is a criminal, or sort of when we don't feel safe around certain types of people, is that work that happens as we sort of gradually progress to decarceration, or is that separate work altogether?
Do you want to jump in?
This is totally unrelated, different
Yeah,
question.
we're going to have 4 unrelated questions, and then Amna's going to have to relate them all.
Okay. So my
Give us a
question,
big crescendo.
my question relates back to the conversation earlier on engaging seriously with liberalism and meeting people where they are. I'm fascinated by how critical discourse problematizing the criminal justice system has now extended to the right, the political right. In what ways does the abolitionist movement take seriously conservative or libertarian political frameworks? And what are the dangers of playing into small government, individual liberty arguments against prison systems and policing systems?
Okay, we'll take one more, Cesar, and then Amna, maybe you can connect the individual and the collective and the right and the left and everything
And
for us.
immigration.
And immigration, okay.
So I was really intrigued in how you specialize also in immigration law and immigration criminal law. And there were a lot of threads in this talk that I kind of wrote down, and I wanted to kind of touch on the 3 of them. So the first one was like the political economy in the system, and how now all these private prisons in the US, remembering our lecture from last semester with Emma Kaufman, how this is a fairly new phenomenon, starting with the Reagan administration, how private prisons are now segregated by foreign national status as opposed to citizens. So just talking on the political economy of that and how that system works to further a goal. And also the prison space as a political space. How do these foreign nationals fit into that framework, not being citizens, and how are they envisioned within that political space and that prison space? And then the third one was just on how you described the post 9/11 national security state, how that kind of fits in with law enforcement, immigration enforcement technologies and policies. And essentially what my question is being a component of criminal justice reform and abolition, or immigration reform being a subset of that, is the immigration reform a lot less stable? Is it less coherent, concrete, because of those components of the citizenship and political spheres?
Okay, thanks. Okay. Thank you. All right. Amna, you
Yeah,
want to have a few last thoughts?
I'll do my best to respond. But
Okay,
like I said,
okay.
I'm happy to keep talking about these things. I
And
mean,
we
on the
will.
first question, how do we embody these commitments on an individual level? I mean, I think the way that you posed the question was a perfect reflection of how to do it, right? I mean, to kind of struggle with these tensions and to think about them and take them seriously. I'll share very quickly one thing that I've been struggling with precisely in the way that you are suggesting. So I recently joined a gym, and as part of the gym membership, they give you a free personal training session, and during that personal training session, they very strongly suggest that you sign up for more, that you have to pay for. And I had the free personal training session, and my trainer is a man of color. The trainer I got for free, with my membership. And during the course of our free session, he repeatedly did things that I found that he was objectifying me and were sexually kind of inappropriate. I didn't feel unsafe because I was in a prison. I was not in a prison. I was in a gym that had a lot of people in it. But there's no way I'm going to sign up for sessions with him. And I keep I keep wanting to do the easy thing, which would be to complain to management. But my kind of abolitionist ethic is telling me that if I want to have this conversation, I need to talk to him directly. And so that's what I'm struggling with. So I think struggling with these things and try to think about how to address these questions without going to the quick kind of punitive option is really important. And try to think about how to hold people accountable in ways that builds relationships and builds security as opposed to taking it down is really kind of the way to go. But there's not an obvious way to do that. The one other thing I'll say is that if you look at the materials of Critical Resistance's police workshop, one of the things that they talk about is to kind of encourage people to think about refraining calling the police and to think about other ways to respond to different issues that or situations we may face. On the question of how to denaturalize crime, I think, and criminality, I think a lot of that has to do with, organizing, running campaigns, thinking about different ways to address these same social problems. I was struck that you said that white people call the police when black people are trying to have barbecues and they aren't actually committing crime. And the reason why I'm struck by that is because if you study the history of crime and criminality in the United States, it's very much comes out of a history of controlling black people and black labor. And so the very idea of crime, the very way that crime gets legislated from the black codes before and onward is very deeply entangled with kind of an anti-black state logic. And so I would encourage you to think about what that means for how we think about crime itself. And to say it's like, oh, they're not committing a crime. I agree, I know what you're saying exactly, and I think that makes complete sense, but how to think about the criminal legal system as not responding to, as Professor Harcourt was saying, some kind of static category of crime, but kind of lending a punitive force to a certain hierarchy of social relations in the way that they already are and are historically embedded, I think is important. On the libertarian bit, I think to the extent that abolition is against prisons and against policing, it could lend itself to a libertarian kind of view. I think the main way that it's not is kind of the other side of abolition. So all the abolitionist writing and organizing says again and again, we're not just for taking walls down, we're for building an alternate view of society. And so I think where the libertarian is going to run into problem with the abolitionist organizing is in that constructive part as opposed to the deconstructive part. And then these last kind of triumvirate of questions, just very quickly, the political economy of incarceration is much more than private prisons, right? And so it's important to kind of think about that. The very distinction between state and market, private and public, is a product of our kind of neoliberal capitalist way of thinking about things. And so to try to think about the interconnectedness of these things, I think is really important. Noah Zatz, who's a law professor at UCLA, for example, is doing really important work right now documenting what he calls carceral work mandates, so all the ways that the carceral state is punishing people for doing things like failing to pay child support and telling them that they have to work in order to be able to pay the child support, and if they don't work, the punishment is sending them to prison. So that's kind of an example that's outside of the private prison context that points to the deep and complicated nature of the political economy of crime and punishment. In terms of the immigrants who are incarcerated and how they relate to the prison as a political space, I think in many ways they relate to the political space in all the complex, contradictory, multitudinous ways that all people who are incarcerated do. So I can't speak broadly about that other than to say, some of the most exciting hunger strikes and that have happened in the last few years have been in immigrant detention facilities and have been in solidarity with prison and hunger strikes that have been happening in other prisons. So I think the connections that are happening both between immigration detention and other carceral spaces and between immigrants and non-immigrants in prison is happening. I guess where I'll end, even though there was a lot more to your question, is to point, because the paper that you read talks about the vision for Black lives. Since then, Mejente, which is a Latinx social movement organization hub, they put out a policy platform which is much shorter and very quick to read, which I would say is an abolitionist approach on immigration reform. They are calling for defunding and ending ICE, which has kind of hit the mainstream in some ways. But they're also calling, for example, decriminalizing entry and re-entry, and so calling for a large kind of decriminalization of immigration violations is central to what they're asking for as well. And there's a lot more to it, but those are some of kind of the key moves that they're making. And so if you want to think about how you might imagine an abolitionist approach to immigration reform, the Mejente platform is the place to start.
Terrific. All right. Well, that was marvelous. Thank you.